If you look at the coronation footage, you'll see that everyone bows and curtsies to the king, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes. And that was because they were angry with Camilla.
A single document reportedly changed everything. Not a royal decree, not a palace statement, and not a newspaper headline, but a legal proposal that, if taken seriously, threatened to do something many royal watchers believed was almost unthinkable. Within hours, whispers of emergency meetings, private consultations, and growing panic began spreading through both Westminster and Buckingham Palace. According to reports circulating among commentators, concern intensified when news emerged of a special parliamentary review connected to Queen Camilla's position within the monarchy. While details remained unclear and many claims were impossible to independently verify, the mere suggestion that lawmakers were discussing measures affecting a senior royal figure immediately transformed what might have been another temporary controversy into a constitutional story with potentially enormous implications. The question was no longer whether criticism existed. The question was whether criticism was evolving into something far more consequential. For years, Camilla's journey through public life had been one of the most remarkable transformations in modern royal history. Once viewed through the lens of controversy, she eventually became queen consort and later queen alongside King Charles III. Yet royal history repeatedly demonstrates that acceptance is not always permanent. Even after titles are secured, public legitimacy remains an ongoing process rather than a final destination. Could the discussions reportedly unfolding in London suggest that old tensions had never fully disappeared? That possibility became increasingly difficult for observers to ignore. As reports continued to emerge, attention shifted toward Parliament itself. Historically, the relationship between the Crown and Parliament has always been one of delicate balance. Each institution derives authority from different sources, yet both depend upon public confidence. Whenever those two centers of influence appear to move toward confrontation, even indirectly, the implications extend well beyond the individuals involved. Some analysts began asking a troubling question. If lawmakers were genuinely concerned about reputational damage to the monarchy, what did that reveal about broader anxieties surrounding the institution? Meanwhile, another development deepened the intrigue. According to accounts referenced by royal commentators, documents and allegations relating to public trust, charitable activities, and perceptions of royal conduct were reportedly becoming part of the wider discussion. Whether all such claims were credible remained open to debate, but their cumulative effect was undeniable. They created an atmosphere in which speculation flourished. Every new report generated another question, and every question seemed to lead to a larger uncertainty about how the monarchy should respond when one of its senior figures becomes the center of national controversy. Inside Buckingham Palace, observers suggested that concern was growing over more than public opinion alone. What made the situation particularly sensitive was timing. The monarchy remains in a period of transition following the end of Queen Elizabeth II's historic reign. During transitional periods, institutions often become especially protective of their public image because stability itself becomes part of the message they are trying to communicate. If confidence begins to weaken, even slightly, senior figures may feel pressure to act in ways they would otherwise avoid. But who exactly would be expected to act? That question soon brought attention back to King Charles III. The monarch occupies a uniquely difficult position whenever institutional concerns intersect with personal relationships. As sovereign, he is expected to place the interests of the crown above individual considerations. As a husband, however, the situation becomes far more complicated. Royal historians have long noted that some of the greatest challenges faced by monarchs occur when private loyalties collide with public responsibilities. Reports suggested that Charles was increasingly being viewed through precisely that lens. Yet the king's position was not the only one attracting scrutiny. Attention also began turning toward Prince William, the Prince of Wales. As heir to the throne, William represents the future direction of the monarchy in the eyes of many supporters. Whenever uncertainty surrounds the institution, public interest naturally shifts toward those expected to guide its next chapter. Some commentators argue that reactions from the future king could prove just as significant as decisions made by the current monarch. Was the Prince of Wales quietly evaluating the long-term implications of the controversy? Or was he attempting to avoid becoming entangled in a dispute that carried significant political risk? No clear answer emerged. Instead, the atmosphere surrounding the story grew increasingly tense. Reports described emergency consultations, legal reviews, strategic discussions, and efforts to assess possible outcomes. Whether every claim reflected reality was impossible to confirm, yet the volume of speculation itself revealed something important. Public attention had moved beyond individual accusations and toward a much larger question about institutional survival. And that is where the story took an even more unexpected turn. According to commentators following developments closely, the debate was beginning to divide not only politicians and media figures, but also sections of the public. Some believe protecting the monarchy required decisive action against controversy wherever it appeared. Others argue that targeting one individual risked creating an even greater crisis by exposing internal divisions. Both sides claimed to be defending the institution, yet they envisioned entirely different paths forward. As those competing visions collided, pressure continued building behind palace walls. What initially appeared to be a controversy surrounding one royal figure was rapidly evolving into a test of how far Britain's most famous institution would go to protect itself during a period of unprecedented scrutiny. And as reports of private meetings and high-level discussions continued to circulate, an even more dramatic question began emerging. If the pressure was already this intense before any final decision had been made, what might happen if the people closest to the throne were eventually forced to choose between loyalty to an individual and loyalty to the monarchy itself? What transformed the situation from a troubling controversy into a potentially historic crisis was not the reported legal review itself. It was the growing realization that the debate had expanded beyond the fate of one royal figure and into a discussion about the monarchy's relationship with public trust. Once that shift occurred, many observers began viewing every new development through a very different lens. According to commentators following the story, concerns inside political circles were no longer being framed solely around allegations or headlines. Instead, attention increasingly focused on a broader institutional question: what happens when public confidence becomes part of the conversation surrounding senior members of the royal family? That question has challenged monarchies throughout history because public confidence cannot simply be restored through official statements. Once doubts emerge, institutions often face pressure to demonstrate accountability as well as stability. This may explain why reports of emergency consultations attracted so much attention. Some analysts noted that extraordinary political discussions tend to occur only when decision-makers believe inaction could become more damaging than action itself. Whether those reports accurately reflected events behind closed doors remained unclear, yet they fueled a perception that influential figures were weighing consequences extending far beyond immediate headlines. The debate appeared to be moving from reputation management into the territory of institutional preservation. That distinction mattered enormously. For decades, the British monarchy has relied upon a carefully maintained separation between political authority and royal symbolism. If discussions were genuinely taking place regarding the conduct or status of a senior royal figure, then observers naturally began asking whether those traditional boundaries were being tested. Was this merely a response to public pressure, or did it reveal deeper anxieties about how the institution would navigate future challenges? The uncertainty surrounding that question only intensified as additional claims emerged. According to reports referenced by royal commentators, concerns were reportedly being discussed not only within political circles, but also among individuals connected to the broader royal establishment. Whether those accounts were entirely accurate was impossible to verify. However, the perception of growing unease carried its own significance. Royal institutions depend heavily upon unity, both real and perceived. Even suggestions of disagreement among influential stakeholders can alter public understanding of a situation. And that is where the story began revealing another layer. Several commentators observed that the controversy seemed to expose competing visions of what protecting the monarchy actually means. One perspective suggested that institutions survive by demonstrating their willingness to confront problems directly, even when doing so involves uncomfortable decisions. Another argued that stability requires protecting continuity and avoiding actions that could create even greater uncertainty. Both approaches claimed to prioritize the monarchy's future, yet they pointed toward radically different strategies. Could those competing philosophies be influencing reactions behind the scenes? Some royal historians believe that moments like this often become significant because they force institutions to define their priorities publicly, even when they would prefer not to. In quieter periods, competing viewpoints can coexist without conflict. During crises, however, choices must eventually be made. Those choices frequently reveal underlying assumptions about leadership, legitimacy, and long-term survival. This is why attention increasingly shifted toward individuals expected to shape the monarchy's future. Reports suggesting that Prince William, the Prince of Wales, was closely monitoring developments attracted particular interest among royal watchers. As the future king, William inevitably represents more than a family member responding to controversy. He represents continuity beyond the current reign. Whenever questions arise concerning the institution's long-term direction, observers naturally examine how the heir to the throne might interpret those challenges. Yet what made the situation especially intriguing was the absence of clear public positioning. Neither dramatic interventions nor decisive declarations appeared to emerge. Instead, uncertainty filled the vacuum. And uncertainty, particularly within royal narratives, often generates more fascination than certainty ever could. Every silence became subject to interpretation. Every reported meeting generated new speculation. Every apparent delay encouraged fresh questions about what calculations might be taking place behind closed doors. Then another issue began attracting attention. According to analysts, the controversy was increasingly being viewed through the context of succession rather than solely through the present moment. The reason was simple. Decisions made during one reign often shape expectations for the next. If the monarchy appeared willing to address controversial situations aggressively, future generations might inherit a very different institutional culture. If it appeared reluctant to act, critics could argue that important opportunities for reform had been missed. Suddenly, the implications stretched far beyond current events. This helps explain why the story continued gaining momentum despite the lack of definitive outcomes. People were no longer debating only what might happen to one individual. They were debating what the monarchy wanted to become. Questions about accountability, modernization, continuity, and institutional resilience all seemed to converge within a single narrative. The controversy had effectively become a proxy for larger conversations that had been developing for years. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of all was the growing sense that multiple power centers appeared to be evaluating the situation simultaneously. Political leaders, royal advisors, public commentators, and senior members of the royal family all seemed to have stakes in the outcome, even if their motivations differed. Whenever so many interests intersect around one issue, the issue itself often becomes more significant than anyone initially expected. And that may be the strongest indication yet that the story is evolving into something much larger. Because while public attention remained focused on the possibility of dramatic decisions, another question quietly emerged beneath the surface. If influential figures across multiple institutions were truly reassessing priorities, relationships, and risks at the same time, could the controversy actually be revealing a broader struggle over how the monarchy should operate in the decades ahead? If so, the developments still to come may prove far more consequential than the events that first brought the story into the spotlight. What began to emerge at this stage was a possibility that many observers had not fully considered at the beginning of the story. The controversy may have appeared to revolve around one individual, but the reaction surrounding it increasingly suggested that different institutions were responding to entirely different concerns. Parliament appeared focused on public confidence. Royal advisors seemed preoccupied with stability. Senior members of the family were reportedly evaluating long-term consequences. When viewed separately, these responses appeared disconnected. When viewed together, however, they started forming a recognizable pattern. That pattern centered on timing. Royal commentators have frequently noted that periods of transition create pressures that remain largely invisible to the public until a triggering event forces them into view. The monarchy is currently navigating one of the most significant transitions in modern history, moving from an institution defined for decades by one monarch into an era that has yet to fully establish its own identity. Under normal circumstances, that adjustment might unfold gradually. Yet according to several analysts, controversies tend to accelerate conversations that were already occurring quietly behind closed doors. If that interpretation is correct, then the reported review may not have created institutional anxieties. It may simply have exposed them. This helps explain why reactions appeared unusually intense compared with the immediate issue itself. Some royal watchers have suggested that powerful institutions rarely mobilize significant resources over a single controversy unless they perceive broader risks attached to it. The real concern may not have been the specific allegations being discussed. Rather, it may have involved what those allegations represented in the context of public trust, future succession, and the monarchy's long-term reputation. That distinction changes the entire meaning of a story. Once the focus shifts from individual conduct to institutional vulnerability, different decisions begin to make more sense. Analysts have noted that organizations facing reputational pressure often become highly sensitive to symbolic issues because symbols influence public perception. In the monarchy's case, perception has always carried extraordinary importance. Unlike political leaders who rely on elections, royal institutions derive much of their strength from continuity, tradition, and public confidence. Any event perceived as weakening those foundations naturally attracts disproportionate attention. Yet another layer emerged when observers began examining who appeared most concerned about the situation. Reports suggested that discussions increasingly involve figures whose primary responsibility was not managing today's headlines, but protecting tomorrow's monarchy. That perspective introduces a fascinating possibility. What if some participants were evaluating the controversy not according to its immediate impact, but according to how future generations might interpret the institution's response? Decisions that seem excessive in the present often appear entirely different when viewed through a long-term strategic lens. This is where Prince William's reported position became particularly significant. The heir to the throne occupies a unique role because his responsibilities extend beyond the current reign. Every future monarch inherits not only assets and traditions, but also the consequences of decisions made by previous generations. Some commentators have suggested that William's generation may be especially focused on preserving flexibility for the future, ensuring that the institution remains adaptable enough to maintain public support in a rapidly changing society. If so, then the debate may have evolved into something much larger than a question about one person's status. Several historians have pointed out that royal history contains recurring examples of institutions making difficult choices during moments of uncertainty. What makes those moments historically significant is not the controversy itself, but what it reveals about priorities. Which values are protected first? Which risks are considered most dangerous? Which relationships become secondary when institutional survival appears to be at stake? Those questions rarely receive direct answers, yet they often shape the future more profoundly than public speeches ever do. That may explain another puzzling aspect of the story. Despite the volume of discussion surrounding legal procedures and political consequences, many observers remained focused on relationships rather than regulations. Why? Because relationships often reveal underlying power dynamics more clearly than official documents. Reports indicating tensions between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility attracted attention precisely because they touched upon one of the oldest challenges in royal history. The crown is both a family and an institution. Those two identities usually coexist. During periods of pressure, however, they can begin pulling in different directions. And that creates difficult choices. Some analysts believe that the reported reactions of key figures make more sense when viewed through this framework. What appears harsh on a personal level may appear necessary on an institutional level. What appears protective from one perspective may appear damaging from another. The contradiction itself is revealing because it highlights the competing pressures operating simultaneously within the monarchy. Yet even this interpretation leaves important questions unanswered. For example, if institutional concerns were driving events, why did the controversy gain momentum so rapidly? And if public trust was genuinely the central issue, why did reactions reportedly vary so dramatically among commentators, politicians, and members of the public? Those inconsistencies suggest that multiple narratives may have been unfolding at the same time, each shaped by different assumptions about what the monarchy's future should look like. Perhaps most intriguing of all is the possibility that the story has never been primarily about accountability, controversy, or even constitutional procedure. Some royal observers have argued that it may instead represent an early glimpse into a broader recalibration already taking place within the institution. A recalibration involving influence, succession planning, public expectations, and the strategic priorities that will define the monarchy for decades to come. And if that assessment contains even a grain of truth, then everything discussed so far may eventually be viewed as background rather than the main event. Because the most important question may not be what happened during the controversy itself, but what key figures learned from it, and whether those lessons are already shaping decisions that have yet to become visible to the public. If they are, then the next development could fundamentally change how this entire story is understood. What made the situation increasingly difficult to dismiss was the way separate concerns began reinforcing one another. What had started as a debate about reputation was now intersecting with questions of leadership, succession, institutional resilience, and public expectations. Each issue alone might have remained manageable. Together, they created a level of pressure that some observers believe could no longer be contained within ordinary palace procedures. Reports suggested that discussions were no longer focused primarily on whether a controversy existed. Instead, attention appeared to be shifting toward how the monarchy intended to respond to an environment in which controversies could rapidly evolve into broader questions about legitimacy. That distinction mattered because institutions are often judged less by the challenges they face than by the decisions they make when those challenges become unavoidable. This may explain why reactions from different quarters seem to become increasingly coordinated, even when no formal coordination was visible. Royal commentators noted that political figures, media analysts, constitutional observers, and palace insiders all appeared to be arriving at a similar conclusion from different directions. The issue was no longer confined to personalities. It had become a test of priorities. Every public statement, every reported meeting, and every apparent delay was being interpreted as evidence of a larger strategic calculation taking place behind the scenes. And those calculations appeared to be growing more complicated. According to analysts, one consequence of a controversy was that it forced influential figures to evaluate risks that extended far beyond the present moment. A decision that protected stability today might create challenges tomorrow. A decision that satisfied public demands in the short term might weaken institutional flexibility in the future. The deeper observers looked, the more they encountered competing responsibilities that could not easily be reconciled. That tension began attracting particular attention because it revealed something fundamental about the monarchy itself. Unlike many public institutions, the crown exists simultaneously as a symbol, a family, and a constitutional entity. During periods of calm, those roles often complement one another. During periods of pressure, however, they can generate conflicting expectations. Some royal watchers argue that the current situation appeared to expose precisely that conflict. What seemed beneficial for one aspect of the institution did not necessarily appear beneficial for another. As these competing pressures intensified, another consequence became increasingly visible. Public discussion was no longer centered on what had happened. Instead, debate increasingly focused on what future decisions might signal. Analysts observe that people often pay close attention to controversial moments because they believe such moments reveal hidden priorities. Which relationships receive protection? Which concerns receive immediate attention? Which risks are treated as unacceptable? Answers to those questions can shape public perception long after the original controversy fades. This is why reported reactions from senior figures generated so much interest. Even limited information attracted intense scrutiny because observers were searching for clues about institutional thinking. Every indication of caution suggested one interpretation. Every indication of urgency suggested another. In the absence of definitive answers, the significance of individual reactions grew rather than diminished. The less certainty existed, the more meaningful every signal appeared. Yet perhaps the most revealing development involved the growing sense that time itself had become a factor. Some commentators suggested that prolonged uncertainty carried risks of its own. Institutions built upon continuity often prefer gradual adaptation, but prolonged ambiguity can create space for competing narratives to take hold. If influential figures believed that public confidence was becoming entangled with unanswered questions, pressure to establish clarity would inevitably increase. That observation led directly to another concern. Several analysts argue that the controversy had effectively become a stress test for the monarchy's decision-making process, not because of the allegations themselves, but because of the number of competing interests involved. Public expectations, constitutional considerations, family relationships, long-term strategy, and institutional reputation all appear to intersect at the same point. Situations involving so many overlapping pressures rarely remain static for long. And that is where the story began moving toward a potential turning point. Reports suggested that discussions were becoming less theoretical and more practical. Observers increasingly focused on possible outcomes rather than possible explanations. The conversation had evolved from understanding the controversy to anticipating its consequences. That shift was significant because it indicated that many people believed a meaningful response of some kind was becoming increasingly likely. Still, uncertainty remained everywhere. Some royal watchers believed the institution would ultimately prioritize continuity above all else. Others argued that protecting long-term credibility required visible adaptation. Both interpretations drew support from different aspects of royal history, and both appeared plausible depending on which pressures one considered most important. The debate itself revealed how difficult the underlying questions had become. What made the situation especially intriguing, however, was that every path forward appeared to involve trade-offs. Protecting stability might invite criticism from those demanding change. Embracing change might unsettle those who valued continuity. Demonstrating loyalty could create institutional complications. Prioritizing institutional concerns could create personal consequences. The closer observers examined the available options, the more they realized that there may no longer be a solution capable of satisfying every stakeholder simultaneously. By this stage, the controversy was no longer functioning as an isolated event. It had become a focal point through which larger anxieties about leadership, succession, authority, and public trust were being expressed. Multiple storylines that initially appeared unrelated were now converging around a single question: how would the monarchy define its priorities when competing obligations could no longer comfortably coexist? And that question may prove more important than any headline associated with the controversy itself. Because if reports of growing pressure, strategic reassessment, and institutional concern are even partially accurate, then the next phase of a story may not simply reveal what decision is made. It may reveal why that decision is made, who ultimately influences it, and whether the monarchy is entering a period of transformation far more significant than most people currently realize. If that is the case, then the developments still ahead could force observers to reinterpret everything that has happened so far through an entirely different lens. What ultimately brings the larger picture into focus is the realization that the controversy was never significant because of the allegations, the headlines, or even the reported discussions themselves. Its significance lies in what it revealed about the forces shaping the monarchy during a period of profound transition. By the time the story reached this stage, many royal observers were no longer asking what had happened. They were asking what the reactions to it revealed. The answer may be more consequential than the original controversy. Throughout the discussion, one pattern repeatedly emerged. Every major institution connected to the story appeared less concerned with the immediate dispute than with the long-term implications surrounding it. Analysts have suggested that this is often how transformational moments begin. Public attention focuses on a specific event, while decision-makers quietly focus on what that event exposes. In this case, what appeared to be exposed was a growing awareness that public trust has become one of the monarchy's most valuable and most vulnerable assets. That realization helps explain why the debate attracted attention far beyond the individuals directly involved. Royal commentators have noted that modern monarchies operate under very different conditions than previous generations. Tradition remains important, but expectations evolve continuously. Public scrutiny moves faster. Narratives form more quickly. Institutional responses face immediate examination. In that environment, controversies can become indicators of larger pressures that have been developing for years. What matters is not always the event itself. What matters is whether the event reveals a changing relationship between the institution and the society it serves. Many observers believe that is precisely why the story resonated so strongly. The discussion appeared to touch upon questions that extend well beyond one moment in time. How should the monarchy balance continuity with adaptation? How should loyalty coexist with accountability? How should future leaders protect tradition while responding to modern expectations? These are not questions that emerge only during crises. They are questions that shape every major institution seeking to remain relevant across generations. And increasingly, attention has shifted toward those future generations. Reports and analysis surrounding the controversy frequently return to the same underlying reality. The monarchy is not simply managing today's challenges. It is preparing for tomorrow's responsibilities. The decisions being evaluated now may influence how future reigns are perceived, how future leaders operate, and how future relationships between the crown and the public continue to evolve. This is why so many observers focused on Prince William and the broader direction represented by the next generation of royal leadership. The significance was never merely personal. It was institutional. The future king will eventually inherit not only a throne, but also a public expectation that the monarchy remains both stable and responsive. Some analysts have argued that many current discussions should be viewed through that lens, not as isolated reactions to controversy, but as part of a longer process of preparing the institution for a changing world. If that assessment is correct, then the story becomes far easier to understand. The controversy served as a pressure point. Under pressure, priorities become visible. Under pressure, assumptions are tested. Under pressure, institutions often discover which values they are most determined to preserve. Whether through reported consultations, strategic discussions, or public reactions, the events surrounding the story appear to reveal an institution actively evaluating how it intends to navigate the future. That future, however, remains unwritten. Royal watchers have pointed out that some of the most important moments in royal history are not remembered because of dramatic announcements. They are remembered because they revealed a shift in thinking that only became obvious years later. At the time, participants often believe they are responding to a specific challenge. Looking back, historians sometimes recognize that they were witnessing the early stages of a broader transformation. Could this ultimately become one of those moments? Perhaps the most enduring lesson from the story is that modern royal narratives are rarely about a single event. They are often about competing responsibilities, evolving expectations, and the ongoing effort to preserve continuity while adapting to change. The controversy may eventually fade from public discussion. The questions it raised, however, are likely to remain relevant for years to come. Because at its heart, this was never simply a story about status, titles, or political reactions. It was a story about leadership. It was a story about public trust. It was a story about how one of the world's oldest institutions responds when confronted by the realities of a new era. And that may be why so many people continue paying attention. The immediate circumstances may eventually become clearer. Future decisions may provide additional answers. New developments may reshape public understanding yet again. But the larger significance already appears visible. The story revealed a monarchy confronting questions that every enduring institution must eventually face: how to protect its legacy, how to maintain confidence, and how to prepare for a future that will inevitably look different from its past. Perhaps that is the most important revelation of all. What appeared at first to be a controversy surrounding one individual increasingly came to represent something much larger, a glimpse into the pressures, priorities, and transformations shaping the next chapter of the British monarchy. Whether history ultimately remembers this as a routine royal dispute or as an early sign of a broader institutional evolution remains uncertain. What is clear is that the conversation it sparked extends far beyond any single headline, and its true significance may only become fully visible with time. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal family, Prince William, the Prince of Wales, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Princess, and the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal analysis. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video.